She didn't know her brother had already signed her name on the contract. She didn't know the wagon waiting outside wasn't meant to carry supplies. She didn't know that by morning she would no longer belong to herself. Elena Cross went to sleep trusting the only family she had left, and woke up in chains. What kind of man sells his own blood? And what kind of woman survives it? Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The night it happened, Elena had made biscuits. That detail would stay with her longer than almost anything else. The smell of them still warm on the iron skillet. The way she'd wrapped two in a cloth for Darius because he always came home hungry when he'd been at the saloon. She'd set them on the table and waited up for him like she always did, because that was what she did. That was what she'd always done. Kept the fire going, kept the food warm, kept believing that somewhere underneath all the drinking and the debts and the ugly moods, her brothers still remembered that they were family. She was 22 years old, and she had been making excuses for Darius Cross for most of her life. Their mother had died when Elena was 9 and Darius was 16. Fever, quick and mean, 3 days, and then nothing. Their father had followed 2 winters later, a logging accident that the foreman said wasn't anyone's fault, though Elena had never entirely believed that. After that, it was just the 2 of them, on a scrap of land in the Missouri hill country that barely grew enough to eat on. Darius had stepped into the role of provider the way some men did, with resentment that he never quite managed to hide. He worked hard when he worked, and he threw away the earnings when he didn't, and Elena had learned early on not to ask questions about where the money went, because the answers only ever made her sick. She'd told herself it would get better once they came west, that the frontier would give him something to build toward, something to care about, that the space and the possibility of it would change the way he moved through the world. She had been wrong about that too. They'd come to Harlan County 8 months ago, following the rumor of work in the copper mines near a settlement called Coldwater Flat. The mines had turned out to be half played out and run by men who underpaid everyone and cheated on the weights. Darius had quit after 3 weeks and taken a job dealing cards at a place called the Red Lantern, which was less a saloon and more a money trap with liquor inside it. Elena had found work mending clothes and washing linens for the families who had real houses in town. Between the 2 of them, they made enough to keep the rented room and eat most days. But Darius had a weakness for the tables, and the tables in Harlan County were controlled by a man named Hollis Crane. Elena had heard the name before she ever saw the face. Crane said the way people said it around here, low and careful, like the name itself had weight. He ran 3 gambling halls in the county and had interests in 2 of the mines, and owned the freight company that most of the settlers depended on for supplies. He was not the law, but he understood how to make the law look the other way. And in Harlan County, that amounted to the same thing. Men who owed Hollis Crane money didn't just lose the money. They lost things afterward that were harder to replace. She'd begged Darius to stop going to the Red Lantern. She'd done it calmly, and she'd done it while crying, and she'd done it with anger she usually kept buried, and none of it had made a difference. He'd look at her the way he always did when she pushed, a little guilty, a little contemptuous, like her concern was both valid and annoying, and then he'd go anyway. He always went anyway. She didn't know, that last night, how deep the debt had gotten. She didn't know, when she heard his boots on the porch steps and unlocked the door, that he wasn't alone. There were 2 of them behind him. Big men, the kind who wore their size like a profession, with the flat eyes of people who'd done unpleasant things often enough that unpleasant things no longer registered. One of them had a stripe of old scar tissue running through his left eyebrow. The other was chewing something and didn't stop chewing when he came through the door. Darius didn't look at her. That was the first sign, though she didn't understand it as a sign yet. She thought he was ashamed of bringing trouble home. She'd seen that expression on him before, the tucked chin and the angled jaw, and she'd interpreted it as remorse. She should have interpreted it as something else entirely. Darius. She stepped back from the door without meaning to, one hand finding the edge of the table. What's going on? It's handled, he said. To the floor. What's handled? Who are these? Miss Cross. The one with the scarred eyebrow spoke. His voice was unhurried, the way voices got when they didn't need to be anything other than what they were. My name is Garrett. I work for Mr. Crane. Your brother has asked us to escort you to the Coldwater processing camp, effective tonight. She heard the words. She even understood them individually. But the sentence they made didn't assemble into meaning right away because it was so far outside anything her brain had prepared for that her mind simply refused to finish the work. "I'm sorry," she said. "He asked you to what?" "Elena." Darius's voice came out smaller than usual. "Don't you Elena me." She moved away from the table, away from both of them, toward the far wall where the kitchen knife was on its hook. Not that she had a plan. Her hands just wanted something to hold. "What did you do?" He finally looked at her. His face was a wreck, red around the eyes, jaw tight. The particular misery of a man who knew exactly what he'd done and had decided it was someone else's fault. "The debt got too big," he said. "I didn't have a choice." "You didn't have a—" She stopped. Started again. "What did you do, Darius?" "Miss Cross." Garrett again, patient as a stone. "You'll be compensated, of course. Mr. Crane operates a legitimate labor arrangement at the processing camp. You'll work off your brother's debt over a period of—" "I'm not property," Elena said. The words came out flat and hard, not loud the way she'd expected, and they landed in the room and sat there. Garrett looked at her with what might have been mild respect if she'd been a horse he was evaluating. "The agreement has been signed. He doesn't have the right to sign anything for me. I'm not—" Her voice cracked on the last word, not from fear but from something closer to incomprehension. "You can't sell a person. Nobody's being sold." The other man, the one who'd been chewing, spoke for the first time. His voice was surprisingly soft for the size of him. "It's a labor contract. You'll be compensated. Food, shelter, the debt cleared." She looked at her brother. He was looking at the biscuits she'd wrapped in cloth and left on the table for him, and something in his face had gone very still. "Darius," she said it quietly. "Look at me." He looked at her. "Tell me you didn't do this." His throat moved. His eyes didn't quite meet hers. They hit the bridge of her nose, somewhere close but not the same, and she knew the answer before he opened his mouth. "I'll come visit," he said. "Once you're settled." "Elena, it's not like it sounds." He said it's a good camp. They need cooks and washerwomen and— She stopped hearing him. Not because she fainted or broke or did any of the things she might have expected of herself in a moment like this. She stopped hearing him because something in her brain made the decision, quietly and without drama, that listening to him finish that sentence was not something she was willing to do. What came in instead of his voice was a different kind of clarity, cold, strange, and utterly awake. She noticed the placement of both men relative to the door. She noticed that the window behind her was latched but not locked. She noticed the weight of the knife on its hook and calculated the distance to it and whether she could get there before either of them moved. She couldn't. She was 5 feet and 4 inches, and she hadn't eaten much that day, and Garrett was between her and the hook and was watching her with the expression of a man who'd had this conversation before. "Are you going to be reasonable about this?" he asked. She looked at him. She looked at the second man. She looked at her brother, who had the decency to look sick about it even if he hadn't had the decency to do anything else. "No," she said, "but I'll come anyway." They let her gather a bag, which she did with extraordinary care, choosing things without looking like she was choosing them. The wool blanket that was thicker than the other one, the small folding knife she kept in her boot, the hardtack and jerky she'd been keeping in a tin for no reason she could articulate at the time. She put on 2 shirts under her coat. She tied her hair back. She did not cry. She did not beg. She picked up the bag and walked out the door and did not look at the biscuits on the table. She didn't look at Darius either. She heard him say her name once more, from behind her, as she went down the porch steps. The night was cold and sharp with the smell of pine, and somewhere far off a coyote was calling, and she walked toward the wagon at the edge of the road and climbed into it herself before Garrett could put a hand on her arm. There were 2 other women already in the wagon. They were huddled at the far end under a shared blanket, and they looked at her with the particular expression of people who have already cried themselves dry and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. One was older, maybe 40, with gray streaking her hair and a bruise yellowing under her left eye. The other was young, younger than Elena, probably not more than 16, and she had her knees pulled up to her chest and her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere past Elena's shoulder. Elena climbed in and settled against the sideboard and met the older woman's eyes. How many stops before the camp? She asked quietly. The woman blinked. 2 more, I think. Maybe 3. There's a farm south of the ridge. How long until we get there? The camp. 2 days? Maybe more. The road gets bad past the river crossing. Elena nodded. She looked at the canvas stretched over the wagon's bows. There was a gap at the back where the flap tied shut, and through it she could see a silver-dollar slice of the night sky and the dark shapes of the pines moving against it. 2 days. She put her bag on her lap and set her hands on top of it and let herself think very carefully about every fact she had. The wagon's speed, the road, the number of men Garrett had with him, the river crossing, and what river crossings typically meant in terms of attention and opportunity. She did not think about Darius. She did not let herself think about Darius, because the shape of that particular wound was too wide to look at directly right now, and she had things to figure out that were more urgent than grief. She was not going to Coldwater Flat. She hadn't decided how yet, but she had decided that much, and she held on to it the way you hold on to a coal in cold weather, carefully, close, aware of what it cost to drop it. The wagon moved for most of the night. Garrett rode up front alongside the driver, and the other man, she'd heard him called Pete, which she wasn't sure was a name or something else, rode behind on a gray horse. There were 2 others she hadn't seen at first, riding wide on either flank, keeping pace without getting close. 4 men total, plus the driver. All armed, she was nearly certain, though only Garrett wore his guns in the open. The road south of Harlan County turned rough quickly, the kind of rough that meant the county didn't care enough to maintain it, all wagon ruts and limestone outcroppings that jolted everything and everyone inside. The older woman, her name was Ruth, she offered it around the 2nd hour, almost shy about it, had taken to pressing both palms flat against the sideboards to keep from being thrown. The young one, whose name was Clara, had eventually tipped sideways onto Ruth's shoulder and fallen into something that looked like sleep, but probably wasn't. Elena stayed awake. She was still awake when the first gray light started showing in the east, and the wagon slowed at a creek crossing. She heard the driver drop down from the seat to check the depth, heard him and Garrett talking in low voices about whether the water was running too high. She kept her eyes mostly closed and listened. Other side before noon. Pete says the ridge roads, just move. He's expecting the delivery by... Delivery. She filed that away. The creek crossing was shallow enough, and they went through it in the early morning with water rising to the floorboards and soaking everything below the knee. Clara made a small sound and pulled her feet up. Ruth pressed her lips together and said nothing. Elena pulled her boots up onto the bag in her lap and breathed through her mouth and watched the gap at the back of the wagon while they were in the middle of the creek, calculating. Too wide. Too exposed. She'd be visible from both flanks before she made the far bank. She let it go. They stopped an hour past the creek to water the horses, and Garrett came around back and looked in at them without particular expression. He'd brought a tin bucket with water in it, and he handed it in without comment and went back around to the horses. Elena drank what she needed and passed the bucket to Ruth. "You're planning something," Ruth said. Very quiet, almost no voice to it, just lips moving. Elena looked at her steadily. "I'm thinking." "They've seen women think before." Ruth glanced at the front of the wagon. "They've caught them too. There was a girl last summer. The Pete one broke her wrist." "I heard you." Elena kept her own voice below hearing distance from the front. "I'm not planning to run into anything blind." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. She had lines around her eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind for years, and underneath the fear and the bruise, there was something solid in her face, something that had been through difficult things and was still there. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elena." Ruth nodded slowly. "All right, Elena." She looked down at her hands. "If you see a way, you let me know." "I will." She meant it. They picked up 2 more women at a farm south of the ridge, just as Ruth had said. A mother and her teenage daughter, both of them silent in the way that meant the silence was new and they hadn't gotten used to carrying it yet. The mother kept her daughter's hand in both of hers the whole time. The daughter stared straight ahead. The wagon was getting crowded. 6 women now, 4 guards, 1 driver, and a road that was getting worse the farther south they went. The pines had given way to scrub oak and dust, and the sky above them was a flat, hard white that bounced light off everything and made the heat worse than it should have been for the time of year. Garrett stopped them again at midday, somewhere near a dry wash that might have been a creek in wetter seasons. He came around to the back and looked them over with the attentiveness of a man counting inventory. "Anybody needs the bushes, say so now," he said. "We won't stop again for a while." There was a small shuffle. One of the guards took the women two at a time to a stand of scrub brush about 30 yards from the wagon, while the other guard stood at the edge of the wash with a hand on his rifle stock. Elena went in the second group with Ruth and Clara. She moved slowly, kept her head down, counted the distance from the brush to the tree line beyond the wash. 200 yards, maybe a little less. Hard ground, not much cover between here and there. The guard was watching them with the professional disinterest of someone who considered his job beneath him. He was looking roughly at them, but not specifically at them, his eyes slightly unfocused, thinking about something else. She thought about running right then. She didn't. 200 yards of open ground, guard with a rifle, no knowing what was on the other side of that tree line. Dying for a bad bet wasn't the same as surviving. She went back to the wagon. It was late in the second day, the light going long and orange through the back canvas flap when she first saw the rider. She wasn't looking for him specifically. She was watching the road the way she'd been watching it for 2 days, cataloging everything, the grade of the land, the placement of the men, the moments when Garrett's attention went forward and Pete's went sideways, and there was a half second of nobody looking directly at the back of the wagon. She was watching because watching was the only thing she could do right now that felt like not giving up. The rider was just a shape at first, coming down from the ridge to the north, moving at the kind of pace that wasn't in a hurry but wasn't slow either. She noticed him because he was alone, which was unusual out here, and because he was coming down toward the road rather than along it, which meant he'd been up on the high ground and had the angle on them. She watched him through the gap in the canvas. He came down out of the scrub and onto the road, maybe 100 yards behind the wagon, and just stayed there, keeping the same distance, neither gaining nor falling back. His horse was dark, black or very dark brown, hard to tell in the failing light. He sat straight in the saddle and carried himself with the particular economy of someone who didn't waste motion. After a few minutes, Pete noticed him. She heard Pete call out to Garrett, low enough that she couldn't make out the words. And she watched through the gap as Pete turned his gray horse and dropped back to reduce the distance between himself and the rider. The rider didn't stop or change speed. What he did do, and she saw this clearly, was look directly at the gap in the canvas. Not at the wagon in general, not at the road ahead. At the specific gap where she was watching from. Just for a second, and then his eyes went back to the middle distance, and he kept riding. Clara had seen it too. She leaned close to Elena's ear. "Who is that?" "I don't know," Elena said, but something had shifted in the air around the wagon. She could feel it without being able to name it exactly. The way weather shifted before a storm, a pressure change you felt in your chest before you understood it with your mind. Garrett had slowed the wagon slightly. Pete had pulled up alongside the rider now, and there seemed to be conversation happening, though she couldn't hear any of it. Then she heard Pete laugh. Short and contemptuous, the laugh of a man who didn't understand what he was looking at. Ruth leaned in beside her. "What's happening?" "I don't know yet," Elena said, "but something is." The rider and Pete rode side by side for another minute or so, unhurried. Then Pete turned his horse and came back up toward the front of the wagon, and the rider dropped back to his original distance and just kept coming, just kept following. She couldn't explain why that made her feel something other than afraid. She should have been afraid. One rider against 5 armed men was not good arithmetic, but there was something about the steadiness of it. The fact that he was still there, still coming, at exactly the pace he'd started with, like the conversation with Pete had been nothing more than a mild interruption. That settled something in her chest she hadn't known was unsettled. She kept watching until the light went too dark to see him clearly. When she could no longer make out his shape on the road behind them, she pulled back from the gap and sat with her back against the sideboards and looked at the dark canvas above her head. Ruth was still watching. "He's still there," she said. "I can see the dust from his horse." Elena nodded. "You know him?" Ruth asked. "No," Elena said. She didn't. She'd never seen that rider in her life. But she'd lived 22 years learning to read people fast, which men meant what they said and which ones said things to fill the silence, which ones were capable and which ones were pretending at it. And she'd gotten good at it out of necessity. You got good at reading people when your survival depended on it. She didn't know the rider's name. She didn't know what he wanted or what he was doing on this road or why he'd looked directly at the gap in the canvas. But she knew, with the bone-level certainty of someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment because there was no one else to trust, that he was not riding in the same direction as Garrett. He was riding against it. They made camp at the edge of a dry creek bed as the stars came out. The wagon stopped and the women were allowed out one at a time to gather wood for the fire, under guard. Elena went when her turn came, moving slowly and without apparent purpose, collecting sticks and branches while she cataloged the camp layout with quick, sideways looks. 4 guards present and visible. Garrett at the fire, Pete walking the perimeter. 2 others she'd mentally labeled Quiet One and the younger one, both stationed near the wagon. The driver was unhitching the team and didn't seem to be armed, or at least wasn't openly armed. The horses were picketed to the north of camp, near a stand of scrub oak. She noted that. The rider was not visible. She looked for him without making it obvious that she was looking, studying the dark shapes of the ridgeline and the trees beyond the camp's firelight, and she didn't see him, which meant either he'd given up and gone south on his own business, or he was out there in the dark being deliberately invisible. She was hoping for the second option. She went back to the wagon and climbed in and settled with her bag across her legs and kept her hands still and her face still, while her mind went over everything she'd observed, arranging it and rearranging it the way you arranged puzzle pieces until the picture started to make sense. Clara had fallen asleep again. The mother and daughter were huddled together at the far end. Ruth was awake, watching Elena. "He's not in the camp," Elena said quietly. Ruth's chin moved in something that might have been a nod. Men like that don't show themselves until they're ready. "You know who he is?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I don't know for certain. But there's a man they talk about in the settlements north of here. Came out of nowhere about 3 years ago. Makes problems go away. The kind of problems the law won't touch. Some say he does it for money. Others say he does it because he's got a particular hatred for men like Crane." She paused. "They call him Maddox." Elena held the name in her head, turned it over. "Is he dangerous?" Ruth looked at her with something close to dry humor. "Honey, the way people talk about him, he makes Crane's men look like the county fair." "That's not what I asked." Ruth considered that. "Dangerous to who you want him to be dangerous to. I expect so." Elena looked out through the gap in the canvas at the fire, at Garrett's broad back, at the dark beyond the ring of light where the rider was or wasn't. She thought about the way he'd looked at the gap in the canvas. Not curious, not predatory. Something else. The look of a man checking to see whether the person inside was paying attention. She'd looked back. She couldn't know if he'd seen her do it, but she'd looked back, and she was still thinking. Sometime after midnight, when the fire had burned low and the guard rotation had settled into the particular sloppiness that came with men who didn't expect trouble, she heard something that wasn't the wind. It was very small, the sound of a stone displaced maybe, or a branch taking weight. Something that didn't quite fit the pattern of the night sounds around camp. She was awake instantly because she'd trained herself over the past 2 days to sleep the way animals slept, light and ready. She kept her breathing even and her eyes mostly closed and listened. Nothing for a long moment. Then Garrett's voice, sharp and sudden from the other side of the wagon. "Who's?" And then quiet. A different kind of quiet. She heard footsteps, one set, deliberate, no attempt at silence, coming around the wagon. She sat up. Clara woke beside her with a sharp intake of breath. Ruth was already sitting, both hands flat on her knees. The canvas flap at the back of the wagon moved. He was taller than she'd expected from watching him ride. Maybe 6 feet, lean rather than big, with a sort of face that had been through weather and hadn't come out worse for it. Dark hair under a battered hat. A jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. Eyes that were doing the same thing her eyes had been doing for 2 days. Taking inventory fast and not being obvious about it. He looked at her first. Specifically at her. The same way he'd looked at the gap in the canvas earlier. Elena Cross, he said. Very quiet. She stared at him. Who are you? Rhett Maddox. He said it like it was practical information rather than introduction. Your brother told Crane your name, Crane told his route boss. The route boss talked too much at the Red Lantern 2 nights ago. He paused. We don't have a lot of time. Where's Garrett? Ruth asked. Sleeping. He said it in a tone that didn't elaborate. The others have about 15 minutes before somebody notices the fire's gone quiet. He looked at Elena again. Can you move? She was already standing up, her bag in hand. All of us, she said. Not a question. He looked at the other women in the wagon. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like he'd planned for one and was now quietly running numbers on 5. All of you, he said, and reached up a hand to help Ruth down. Elena dropped out of the wagon herself before he could reach for her, landing quiet on both feet and straightened up and looked at the camp. 2 guards at the perimeter. Driver asleep against a wheel. Fire low. Trees to the north, dark and close. She looked at Maddox. He was watching her the way she'd watched him, assessing, not unkind, not fully trusting either, like they were 2 people who'd just made an agreement with each other that neither of them had fully read yet. North? She asked. North, he said. She turned and moved toward the trees, and she didn't look back. The pines swallowed them almost immediately, the dark closing in thick and directionless the way only woods at night could manage. Maddox moved ahead of them with the unsettling confidence of a man who knew where he was going even when she couldn't see how he could know it. No hesitation, no course corrections, just forward movement through the black. She could hear the others behind her, the mother whispering something low to her daughter, Clara breathing too fast and trying to quiet it. Elena kept close to Maddox without crowding him. She could feel the cold of the night settling in now that they were moving, working through the wool of her coat, and she breathed it in and let the sharpness of it keep her focused. They were maybe 5 minutes into the trees when she heard the first shout from camp. It was too far back to make out words, just a voice going up suddenly, then another, then nothing, then a gunshot, then 3 more. Maddox said without turning his head, "Keep moving. They're shooting at shadows." "You're sure?" Elena asked. "Pretty sure," he said, which was not entirely the reassurance she'd been looking for, but she kept moving. The trees thinned after another 10 minutes, and the ground began to slope upward into the rocky skirt of the ridge. Maddox's horse was tied there, dark against the darker rock, and beside it were 4 others she hadn't seen him bring. Smaller horses, mixed quality, but horses. He'd brought horses. She looked at him. "Thought it through ahead of time," he said, reading the look correctly. "Where did you get them?" "Borrowed them." A pause. "The man I borrowed them from won't argue about it." She looked at the horses and thought about the fact that he'd known she was on the wagon, known her name, found them in the dark, gotten past 4 armed guards, and procured 5 extra horses. She thought about Ruth's voice saying he makes Crane's men look like the county fair. "Thank you," she said. She said it straight, without any of the breathless quality people sometimes put into gratitude when they were still in shock. Just the 2 words, clear. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression. Not quite a smile, something more economical than that. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We've still got a problem." She settled into the saddle of the nearest horse and looked down at him. "What problem?" He looked back toward the dark below the ridge where the camp was. "Crane knows I'm in the territory. He doesn't know why yet, but he will by morning." He took the reins of his own horse. "The only way this ends safely for any of you is if Crane can't reach any of you ever again." He looked up at her. "That means finishing this. Not just running." She held his gaze. The cold was sharp and the stars were very bright, and somewhere behind them Crane's men were moving through the dark with guns. She thought about Darius's voice saying, "It's not like it sounds." She thought about the 2 women at the farm south of the ridge who'd been loaded into a wagon like goods. She thought about Garrett's word, delivery. "What does finishing this look like?" she asked. Maddox put a boot in the stirrup and swung up. "It means going to Coldwater Flat," he said. "Not as a prisoner." He looked at her. "As something else." The ridge wind moved through the pines above them, and the horses shifted and stamped. and the campfires were gone now below, swallowed by the dark and the distance. Elena Cross looked south, toward Coldwater Flat, toward Hollis Crane, toward everything that had been decided for her without her consent. Then she looked at Rhett Maddox. "Tell me what you know about the settlement," she said. And he started to talk, and she started to listen, and the night moved around them like a river finding its course, and neither one of them looked back. Maddox talked, and Elena listened, and by the time the first real light came up over the eastern ridge, she had a picture of Coldwater Flat that was ugly in its specifics. It wasn't a mining settlement the way she'd understood the term. It had been, once, copper, played out 2 seasons back, same as the mines near Harlan County. What Hollis Crane had done with the empty infrastructure was the kind of thing that happened in places where the law stopped at the county line, and nobody with authority cared what was beyond it. He'd kept the bunkhouses and the processing sheds and the fencing and turned the whole compound into something closer to a private labor colony. Women for the cooking and washing and whatever else his foremen decided to require. Men for the hauling and the fencing and the road work he sold to freight companies who didn't ask about the workforce. The people inside weren't technically enslaved in the paperwork. They had contracts. Crane's lawyer in Harlan County had apparently been very creative with contract language. "How many people in the camp?" Elena asked. "Last count I got was around 40. Maddox was riding slightly ahead, navigating a deer trail that climbed the backside of the ridge. "Could be more now. He's been running convoys every 2-3 weeks. "Guards?" 8, maybe 10. They rotate. Most of them are serious, couple of them aren't." He paused. "The serious ones are concentrated around the east perimeter, near the main gate. The north fence is weaker, 1 man, and he moves slow." She noticed he'd answered her questions in order, without redirecting them, without suggesting she ask something easier. She filed that away. Ruth was riding just behind Elena, and Clara after her, and the mother, her name was Vera, had her daughter tucked against her side on the same horse, the girl half asleep against her shoulder. They were moving slowly because of the double-loaded horse and because the trail was rough and nobody wanted a thrown shoe in the dark. "You said finishing this," Elena said. "Going in as something other than a prisoner. What did you mean by that exactly?" Maddox was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing between versions of the truth. "I've been trying to get eyes inside that camp for 2 months," he said. "Every approach I've tried from outside hasn't gotten me close enough. Crane's got lookouts on the ridges and a standing order that any unfamiliar rider gets turned back at the perimeter." He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her. "The only people who go in and out freely are Crane's men, and his deliveries." The words sat there between them. "You want to go in with us?" Elena said. "Not with you." He corrected it without heat. "As one of Garrett's men. Garrett's not going to make it back to that camp. He's going to be recovering from a very bad night for a few days. By the time Crane realizes the convoy's been cut loose, I'll already be inside." He paused. "And you'll already be inside." She looked at the trail ahead, at the dark between the trees, at nothing specific while she thought it through. "What happens to the others?" "I've got a contact at a homestead north of the ridge. A family named Foss. Vera and her daughter and Clara go there. Stay quiet for a few days. Ruth..." He glanced back at Ruth. "That's your call." Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I'm 61 years old with a bad knee, and I've got nothing left to go back to. Whatever she decides, I'll do." Elena looked at Maddox. "And what's my role in this? Inside the camp?" "You get brought in as part of the delivery, which means you get access to the bunkhouses, the processing shed, the kitchen, places I can't go as a guard without drawing attention." His voice was even, not apologetic. "I need someone inside who can move around and remember what they see. A spy. I was going to say observer, but yes." She thought about the camp in her mind, the picture she'd been building from his words, and she thought about 40 people inside the fence and 8 guards and what Crane's foreman required of the women in their charge. She thought about what saying yes meant and what saying no meant, and she was honest with herself about the fact that saying no meant riding north with Vera and Clara and sitting in someone else's house waiting for a man she'd known for 6 hours to either solve the problem or get killed trying. She'd spent her whole life waiting for men to either solve problems or get killed trying. It hadn't worked out particularly well. I need to know what you're planning to do once you have what you need, she said. I'm not walking into that camp without knowing what I'm walking into it for. Maddox pulled his horse up and turned to face her. In the early morning light, she could see his face properly for the first time. The lines of it, the steadiness in the eyes, the particular quality of someone who had seen a lot of bad things and hadn't finished deciding what to do about them. Crane's operation runs on one thing, he said. The people who supply him with labor and the people who buy his labor both think the other side of the deal will protect them if something goes wrong. Cut that connection, expose the contracts, the names, the routes, and the whole structure falls because nobody wants to be the one holding the evidence when it lands in front of a federal judge. He paused. There's a man in Santa Fe, federal marshal, not a county man. I've been building a case for him for 8 months. What I need is what's inside Crane's office, the ledgers, the contracts, the correspondence, enough to make it impossible for his lawyers to paper over. And the people inside the camp? Once the federal man moves, Crane's authority in the county collapses. The guards scatter, the camp dissolves. Something moved in his jaw. That's the plan. How long? A week, maybe less if we move right. She looked at him. And if it goes wrong? He met her eyes without flinching. Then we figure something else out. It wasn't reassurance. It wasn't the kind of thing a man said when he was trying to make you feel better. It was just the truth of the situation delivered without decoration, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she trusted it more than she would have trusted a promise. All right, she said. Tell me what Crane's men look like. They split before dawn at a fork in the deer trail where a dry watercourse ran west toward lower ground. Maddox gave Vera directions to the Foss homestead in the careful, specific way of someone who'd made sure of them beforehand. Third Ridge north, follow the watercourse until the split cottonwood, left fork to the canyon mouth. The house was red-doored. Clara hugged Elena once, quickly, with the desperation of someone who understood they were being left with strangers. The daughter didn't say anything, but her eyes were very wide. Vera pressed Elena's hand between both of hers. Be careful, she said. You too, Elena said. Ruth stayed. She'd said she would, and she did, which Elena had half expected and was quietly grateful for in a way she didn't say out loud. 3 people going back toward the road were less suspicious than 2, and Ruth's age and apparent exhaustion were exactly the kind of thing a trafficking route boss would find unremarkable. Maddox had obtained, from somewhere she didn't ask about, a second set of route papers that would read as credible to anyone who didn't look too carefully at the dates. The walk back down to the main road took 40 minutes. They left the horses in a draw behind a limestone outcropping and came out on the road on foot, dusty and tired in the way that didn't need to be performed. Elena had turned her coat inside out because the lining was darker, and she'd knocked the cleanness out of her hair, and she walked with a slight hitch in her left leg that she maintained through willpower alone. Maddox, riding ahead as their escort, looked like a different man with a different hat and someone else's duster. He hadn't altered his face or his build, neither was the kind of thing you could alter without theater, but he'd changed enough of the visible signifiers that anyone who hadn't studied him carefully wouldn't recognize the shift. They encountered the first of Crane's outriders, about 2 miles south of where the original convoy had camped. He was young, maybe 19, with a rifle across his saddle and the slightly defensive posture of someone who wasn't entirely sure of his authority. He looked at Maddox and then at the women and then back at Maddox. Garrett's party? He asked. What's left of it? Maddox's voice had changed. Not completely, but enough, flatter, and with a particular boredom in it. Trouble on the North Road last night. Lost 2 men and most of the horses. Garrett's back in Harlan waiting out a broken collarbone. He pulled the route papers from his coat and extended them without invitation. I'm taking the rest of the delivery in. You want to send word ahead to Mr. Crane? You do that. The outrider looked at the papers. Elena watched his eyes move across them without any obvious skill for reading. He handed them back. Camp's another 6 miles, he said. Stay on the road. Maddox tucked the papers away. Much obliged. They kept moving. Elena did not look at the outrider as they passed him, which was a choice she'd thought about and made deliberately. Looking at him would have been natural curiosity, but it also would have given him a clear look at her face. She kept her eyes on the road and her chin slightly down and counted her steps until she was sure he was behind them. Beside her, Ruth said nothing. Her knee was bothering her. Elena could tell from the way she was walking the slight stiffness on the downhill steps. But she didn't mention it, and Elena didn't mention noticing it. 6 miles. Elena put her mind to work on them. Coldwater Flat was not what the name suggested. There was no water, and it wasn't flat. It sat in the crook of 2 ridges, ringed by a timber fence that had been built by people who knew what fences were for. The main gate faced east, 2 guards visible from the road, a watchtower behind the fence line. Inside, she could see the tops of structures, low utilitarian buildings the color of old wood, a taller shed with a metal chimney that was smoking. The smell coming off the place was smoke and unwashed people and something chemical she couldn't identify, a sharp mineral smell that probably had to do with whatever processing the sheds were used for now. There were people moving inside the fence. She could see them through the gate as they approached. Mostly women, moving between buildings with the particular efficiency of people who've learned to make themselves inconspicuous. A few men near the north fence, working at something she couldn't make out. Nobody was running or shouting. It had the terrible normalcy of a place that had been operating long enough that its wrongness had settled into routine. The gate guard looked at Maddox's papers more carefully than the outrider had, but not carefully enough, and they went through. The foreman who came to collect them was a wide man named Briggs, who smelled of tobacco and had the air of someone who'd been made slightly important in a small place and had built his whole personality around it. He looked at Elena and Ruth with the evaluative blankness of someone deciding which bin to sort them into. 2, he said. Garrett said 6. Garrett didn't account for an ambush on the North Road, Maddox said. These 2 were recovered, the others scattered. He held the foreman's gaze. Mr. Crane can discuss the details with Garrett when Garrett's shoulder heals. Briggs looked like he had opinions about this, but wasn't sure where to put them. He turned to Elena. Can you cook? Yes, she said. Can you? He was looking at Ruth now. Better than whoever you've got now, I expect, Ruth said. Briggs made a sound that wasn't quite appreciation and told someone behind him to show them to the women's bunkhouse. Then he turned back to Maddox. You're staying on? Until Mr. Crane decides otherwise, Maddox said. I'll need to be put on the rotation. Briggs looked at him for a moment with the mild suspicion of a man who was used to suspicious things and had learned not to act on most of them. Then he nodded and walked away, and Maddox looked at Elena over the foreman's retreating back. His expression said nothing in particular. Hers said, I'll start looking tonight. The women's bunkhouse held 19 people in a space built for 12. Double-tiered bunks along 3 walls, a potbelly stove at one end that didn't put out enough heat to matter, a single window on the west wall with no glass in it, just a board that could be propped open or shut. The smell was close but not unbearable, which said something about the women inside it, who were maintaining basic cleanliness under circumstances that didn't make it easy. They looked at Elena and Ruth when they were brought in, and the look was the same one Elena had given the convoy wagon when she'd first climbed in. Not hostile, not welcoming, just the careful assessment of people who'd learned that new arrivals could mean anything. A woman named Doris, who seemed to be some sort of informal organizer by virtue of having been there longer than anyone else, showed them the empty bunks and explained the schedule without being asked. Kitchen duty started at 4:30. Washing ran all morning. Afternoons were the processing shed, sorting and packing whatever Crane's foreman decided needed sorting and packing. After supper, inside by dark. The guards did a head count at 9. What's in the processing shed? Elena asked. Doris looked at her steadily. Mineral salts. For the freight companies, some of them use it for curing. She paused. And some other things Mr. Crane doesn't explain. Elena nodded. Where does Crane keep his office? The silence in the bunkhouse shifted. Why do you want to know that? Doris asked. Elena looked around the room. 19 women, some older, some younger than her, all watching, all carrying the particular weight of people who'd been told their situation was their situation and there was nothing to do about it. Because I'm not planning to spend the rest of my life in here, Elena said. And I'd guess I'm not the only one. The silence held for another long moment. Then Doris said, quiet enough that only the nearest women could hear. Main building, north side of the compound. He comes out twice a day. morning and evening meal. In between, he stays in there with his ledgers and his whiskey. Elena asked 2 more questions, where the guards rotated slowest and whether the mine shafts were still accessible. And she asked them calmly and without drama, and Doris answered both of them, which told her something important about Doris. That night, lying on the bunk with Ruth's breathing going slow and even in the bunk below, Elena stared at the board over the window and built the camp in her mind, the way she'd built it from Maddox's descriptions on the ridge, filling in what she'd seen during the walk from the gate to the bunkhouse, the processing shed's position, the main building's 2 windows facing east, the angle of the watchtower to the north fence, the mine entrance, partially collapsed but not completely. She'd caught the dark line of it beyond the northwest corner of the compound. The explosives Doris had mentioned almost in passing, as though it were unremarkable. Yeah, they keep blasting powder in the old equipment shed, for clearing rock, supposedly. Nobody goes near it. Elena had filed that away without letting it show on her face. There were things in this camp that could be made useful. There were weaknesses Crane's men had stopped seeing because they'd been looking at them every day without consequence. She didn't have a complete plan yet. She had pieces of one, and the knowledge that pieces were enough to start with. In the morning, she would go to the kitchen and learn who worked there and what could be taken without being noticed. She would move through the compound with her eyes open and her face mild. She would be unremarkable, and she would be patient, and she would build the rest of the picture until it was complete. Somewhere out there in the dark of the compound, Maddox was doing the same thing from the other side of the fence. She hadn't seen him since the gate. She didn't expect to see him soon. That was fine. They didn't need to see each other to be working in the same direction, and she'd understood that from the moment she'd agreed to this on the back of a horse on a cold ridge in the dark. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep immediately. Her mind was still moving, still cataloging, still building. But eventually, the exhaustion of 2 days and 2 nights caught up to the machinery of her brain and pulled it under, and she slept without dreaming. And in the morning, she was up before Doris called the kitchen crew, already pulling on her boots, already thinking. The camp was quiet in the early hours. The guards on the north fence moved with the slowness of men not expecting anything. The mine entrance sat dark and still beyond the northwest corner. Elena looked at it as she crossed the yard toward the kitchen, and her expression gave away nothing at all. 5 days inside Coldwater Flat was enough to understand how the place breathed. Elena had spent those 5 days being exactly what Briggs expected her to be: quiet, useful, unremarkable. She worked the kitchen from 4:30 in the morning until the breakfast pans were scraped clean, then moved to the washing lines, then to the processing shed in the afternoons where the women sorted mineral salts into burlap sacks while the chemical smell worked its way into the back of the throat and stayed there. She kept her head down and her hands busy, and her eyes moving in the careful peripheral way she'd been practicing since she was old enough to understand that watching openly got you noticed, and watching sideways got you information. She knew the guard rotation now as well as the guards knew it themselves. Better, probably, because the guards had gotten careless about it, and she hadn't. She knew that the man on the north fence, a heavy-set older fellow everyone called Dutch, stopped at the northeast corner for a smoke break at 9:15 every night without variation, and that the break lasted between 8 and 12 minutes depending on the wind. She knew that Briggs did his evening walk of the compound at 7, always in the same order, always ending at the main building where Crane kept his office, and that the walk took 19 minutes. She knew that the processing shed's back wall shared a foundation with the old equipment shed, and that the equipment shed's lock was a rusted thing that a good hard pull would defeat without needing a key. She also knew, by the 3rd day, where Hollis Crane kept his ledgers. She'd seen him twice, once at the morning meal on the first day, when he'd come out of the main building to speak with Briggs, and once on the 3rd afternoon when he'd walked the compound with a man in a town suit who had the look of a lawyer or a buyer, or possibly both. Crane was smaller than she'd pictured from Ruth's description of him. Average height, going soft around the middle, with the careful dress of a man who wanted to be taken for something more substantial than he was. He had cold eyes, and he smiled at the wrong moments, and she'd watched him from the washing lines and thought, "This is the man who bought my name from my brother." She'd let herself think it directly, hold it, feel the full shape of what it meant. Then she'd put it aside and gone back to watching. His office was the north room of the main building. She knew this because on the third night, after the head count, she'd told Doris she needed air and stepped outside into the compound for the 7 minutes the guards allowed between head count and lights out. She'd positioned herself at the corner of the bunkhouse and watched the main building's north window, which had a lamp burning in it well past the time the rest of the building went dark. She'd watched the shadow moving behind the curtain, sitting, leaning forward over a surface, not moving much. A man with his paperwork. On the fourth night, she'd told Doris the same thing and gone outside at the same time. But this time she'd moved along the shadow of the bunkhouse wall to the edge of the equipment shed, and she'd pulled the lock, one hard pull, angling upward the way she'd noticed the hasp was bent, and gone inside. She'd stood in the dark of that shed for 2 full minutes, breathing slowly, waiting for her eyes to adjust and for her heart rate to do the same. Then she'd started moving her hands along the shelves. The blasting powder was in a crate against the back wall, 4 wooden kegs of it, with a coil of fuse line beside them on the shelf. She'd known it was there from what Doris had said, but knowing it and standing in the dark with her hand on it were different things. She'd stood there with her palm flat on the top of the nearest keg and thought about what 4 kegs in the right position would do to the foundation of the mine entrance, and what the mine entrance collapsing would do to the only road out of the camp's west side. She'd put the thought away carefully, like something she'd need again soon, and gone back to the bunkhouse before the lights out bell. On the 5th day, she found a way to talk to Maddox. It happened by accident that turned into purpose, which was the way most useful things happened. She was crossing the compound with a load of washing at mid-morning when she saw him at the water pump near the main building, filling a bucket with the unhurried ease of a man doing a job he'd been assigned. He had his hat brim low, and he didn't look at her when she came near. She stopped at the pump and set her washing basket down and worked the handle alongside him, filling the rinsing bucket she'd brought. They were close enough to talk without raising their voices. The nearest guard was 30 feet away and watching the gate. "Office is the north room," she said. Quiet, face forward, like she was talking to herself. "He's in there evenings after 7. Lock on the main building's east door is keyed the same as the equipment shed. I could see the key blank when Briggs used it." She pumped the handle. Blasting powder in the equipment shed, 4 kegs, full, fuse line on the shelf to the left. A pause. She heard the water moving in his bucket. "How many people know the mine shaft is partially open?" he asked. His voice was the same flat, unhurried register he used for everything. "Doris and 2 others. They don't talk about it. The shaft connects to the east tunnel. The east tunnel runs under the equipment shed." Another pause. "Elena." She looked at the water in her bucket. "The federal man is coming," he said. "I got word out yesterday through the supply rider. He'll be here in 3 days, 4 at the outside. He's bringing 6 deputies." He worked the pump handle once more. "We need Crane in that office when they arrive, and we need the ledgers intact. If he gets spooked and burns the paperwork before they can get through the gate, the case falls apart." She thought about that. "He'd hear 6 riders coming on the road." "Yes. So you need something that pulls his attention the other way. Something that makes leaving the building seem like the worst option." She looked at the main building, looked at the equipment shed, looked at the mine entrance beyond the northwest corner with its dark mouth and its rotten timber shoring. "If the mine came down," she said slowly, "it would take the west fence with it. Everyone in the camp would be running for the east gate, including Crane. And anyone in the east road when 6 deputies came through it would run back inside." She finished the thought. He'd lock himself in the office. With the ledgers. She picked up her washing basket. Her hands were steady. "I'd need 2 nights to move the powder into position in the shaft. Not all at once. A little each night, enough that if someone opens the shed, it doesn't look changed. Can you do that without being seen?" "Dutch takes 8 to 12 minutes at the northeast corner," she said. "The shaft entrance is 15 seconds from the equipment shed at a walk." She paused. "Yes." He picked up his bucket. His eyes moved to hers for just a second, the same brief, direct look he'd given her through the gap in the wagon canvas, the look that was an assessment and something slightly less categorizable than that. 3 nights from now," he said. "After the evening head count." She nodded once and walked away and didn't look back. Bah. The next 2 nights she moved in the dark with her heart in her throat and her hands doing what she told them to do regardless. She'd told Ruth, quietly, in the bunkhouse, at a moment when the other women were sleeping or close to it, and Ruth had not argued or tried to talk her out of it. She just said, "Tell me what you need me to do." And Elena had said, "Be ready to move on the third night," and Ruth had said, "All right," and that had been the whole conversation. She took powder from the crate in small amounts, wrapped in her extra shirt, and moved it through the dark in the 8 to 12 minutes that Dutch was smoking at the northeast corner. The shaft entrance was unboarded on the inside, the timber having rotted through sometime in the past year, and the opening was just wide enough for her to lower herself in and place the wrapped bundles on the ledge inside before climbing out again. The smell of old rock and standing water came up from below, and she ignored it and did the work. On the second trip, she brought the fuse line and measured it with her hands in the dark. 6 feet from the shaft entrance to the ledge, another 3 feet of play. She'd need 9 feet of fuse minimum to give herself time to get clear. She had more than that. By the end of the second night, 4 kegs of blasting powder were in position on the ledge inside the east tunnel, and the equipment shed behind her was empty of anything that would have told that story. She went back to her bunk and lay there in the dark and breathed until her heart rate came down, and then she lay there a while longer because there was something she hadn't let herself think about clearly until now, and she needed to think about it. Darius was going to hear what happened here. Word would get out. It always did. And it would reach Harlan County, and it would reach her brother, and he was going to know that she'd been here and what she'd done. She'd thought about that and set it aside because it wasn't useful while she was in the middle of doing the thing. But now, in the quiet before the third day, she let herself feel it fully. She wasn't angry anymore. That was the strange part. The anger she'd felt in the room when Garrett said, "Your brother has asked us to escort you." That feeling had been enormous and immediate, and she'd thought it might stay that way forever. But somewhere in the past 5 days of working and watching and planning, it had shifted into something flatter and colder. Not forgiveness. She didn't have a word for it exactly. More like she'd set Darius down somewhere behind her on the road and kept walking, and the distance had changed the weight of him. She thought about the 2 wrapped biscuits she'd left on the table. She put that away. She closed her eyes, and in the morning she was ready. Masham. The third night came down clear and cold, a thin moon giving just enough light to navigate by and not enough to expose anything. Elena had told Doris during the afternoon work shift, low enough for only Doris to hear. Tonight, after head count, get everyone to the east side of the bunkhouse and stay there. Don't ask questions. Doris had looked at her for a long moment with those measuring eyes. "You're going to do something." "Yes." "Is it going to be loud?" "Probably." Doris had turned back to her salt sacks. "East side," she'd said. "Got it." The head count ran at 9. Elena stood in line with the other women in the bunkhouse, counted off, watched Briggs make his mark in the book. He didn't look at her face. He never looked at their faces during head count, just their positions in the line, which was a habit that said something about how he thought of them and also meant that she'd been able to swap position with Ruth twice in 5 days without it registering. Briggs left. The compound went to its night routine. Dutch moved toward the northeast corner with his slow, heavy tread. Elena was out the bunkhouse door 40 seconds after Doris called lights out. Moving along the wall in the dark, the fuse line coiled over one shoulder and the striker box in her coat pocket. She moved to the shaft entrance and crouched and pulled the cover board aside and lowered herself in by feel, the rock cold and damp against her palms. She found the fuse ends where she'd attached them 2 nights ago and checked each connection with her fingers, moving along the ledge in the dark until she was satisfied that the line ran clean to all 4 kegs. She climbed back out. She uncoiled the fuse line up to the shaft entrance, laid it flat on the ground, and straightened up. Dutch had not come back from the northeast corner yet. She looked across the compound. The main building's north window had its lamp burning. Crane was in there. She could see the shadow. She put her hand in her pocket and touched the striker box and waited. From the far side of the compound near the east gate, she heard a voice, Maddox's, though she'd never heard it loud before. It was carrying across the compound with a flat, carrying clarity that pulled every head up from every station. "Crane," he called. Not shouting exactly, just big, the way a voice got when it wasn't afraid of being heard. "Hollis Crane, you've got federal deputies on the East Road. They'll be through your gate in about 3 minutes. The compound did what compounds did when something like that was said in the middle of the night. It seized. She heard voices, the scrape of boots, the guard at the watchtower calling down something she couldn't make out. She heard Briggs shouting. She heard, from the east gate, the sound of horses on the road, which was real and not part of the performance, which meant the deputies were exactly where Maddox had said they'd be. The north window of the main building went dark. She thought, he's moving away from the lamp. She thought, he's going for the ledgers. She struck the box and put the flame to the fuse line. It caught on the second try. The first had sputtered, and for one very bad second she'd thought the damp had gotten to it. And then it was running, eating itself down the line toward the shaft entrance, and she was already moving. She crossed the compound at a run she hadn't planned to run, because the plan had been to walk casually toward the east bunkhouse and get behind it before the charge went. But something in her body made its own decision, and she ran, covering the ground in long strides, and she was behind the bunkhouse wall and breathing hard against the timber when the world came apart. The sound was not what she'd expected. She'd expected a bang, the sharp crack of blasting powder doing its work. What she got instead was more like the earth deciding to disagree with itself. A deep, rolling concussion that she felt in her sternum before she heard it in her ears, followed immediately by a sound like every tree in a forest falling at once. The ground under her boots jumped. The bunkhouse wall shuddered against her back. From around the corner came a rushing wall of displaced air that hit her face and took her breath, and then was gone. Then dust. Dust and silence, and then, from the northwest, the slow grinding continuation of the mine giving up the last of its structural argument. The west fence came down in sections. She heard it go, post by post, the timber splitting and the wire snapping in sequence, and then the whole northwest section folding inward like something tired of standing. The dust rose in a column that blotted out the thin moon and turned everything beyond 10 feet into nothing. She could hear people running. She could hear guards shouting to each other in the confused, high-register way of men who had prepared for certain kinds of trouble and had encountered a different kind entirely. She heard someone, she thought it was Briggs, calling for a head count, and she thought, good luck with that. She came around the east side of the bunkhouse where Doris had the women gathered, 19 of them pressed close in the dark, most of them holding on to each other, all of them present as far as Elena could see in the bad light. Main gate's going to open in about 2 minutes when those deputies come through, Elena said. Her voice was rougher than she expected, dust and exertion. When it does, you go through it. Don't stop, don't wait for anyone to give permission. Go through and keep going east on the road. What about the guards? Someone asked. They've got bigger problems right now. She looked at Doris. Can you get them moving? Doris looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between stunned and something else, something that hadn't had a chance to fully form yet. Yes, she said. Yes, I can do that. From the east gate came the sound of horses and voices and wood under stress, and then the gates came open, not gently, not in the manner of a formal entrance. And the shapes of riders came through in the dust and dim light, and one of them was shouting something about federal authority that got swallowed by the noise of everything else happening at once. Elena moved through the chaos toward the main building. She was not entirely sure why, except that she wanted to see it. The north room's door was on the building's east side, and it was not locked. She pushed it open, and it swung, and the lamp was back on inside, burning low. And Hollis Crane was standing at his desk with both hands pressed flat on the surface, looking at a stack of ledgers like he was trying to decide something. He looked up when she came through the door. He didn't recognize her. She could see that immediately. She was a woman from his labor camp, and he had never learned to see the women in his labor camp as individual faces. She was nobody to him. "Get out," he said. His voice was controlled, barely. She stood in the doorway. Outside the building, she could hear the deputies moving through the compound, calling out, and she could hear Maddox's voice among them, directing them toward the north end. "There are federal deputies in your compound right now," she said. "They're looking for your ledgers." Something crossed his face. Fear, calculation, the frantic arithmetic of a man running numbers on his options. "You need to think about what you're going to do in the next 30 seconds, she said. "Because whatever you decide, it's the decision they're going to find you with." She stepped back out of the doorway. She heard him make a sound. Not words, just a sound. The compressed exhale of someone who understood that all the options had narrowed down to none of them being good. And then she heard him sit down, the chair taking his weight. And that was the last thing she heard from inside that room before the deputy's boots came down the passage and she stepped aside to let them pass. She found Maddox at the east gate. He was standing just inside it, not particularly close to anything, watching the compound with the same expression he'd worn on the ridge in the dark, assessing, not yet done calculating. There was blood on the left side of his jaw from something she hadn't seen happen, and he was holding his left arm slightly wrong, but he was standing upright and present, which was what mattered. She stopped beside him. "He's in the north room," she said, "sitting with the ledgers." Maddox looked at her. He looked at the dust on her face and the burn mark on her right hand from the striker box striking wrong, which he hadn't noticed until just now. "Your hand," he said. "It's fine." She looked at the mark. It was a thin line across two knuckles, red and starting to sting now that the adrenaline was thinning. "It'll keep." He looked at her for another moment, and then he looked back at the compound where the deputies were moving through the settling dust, and the guards were being collected, and Doris was leading the women through the gate in a line that was steady and purposeful and not stopping for anything. Darius's name rose in her throat, and she pushed it down. Not now. Possibly not ever, in the sense of it being something she needed to say out loud tonight. She stood next to Maddox in the broken gate of Coldwater Flat and watched the deputies do their work, and the dust came down slow around them, and the mine entrance at the northwest corner had stopped its grinding and was just a raw wound in the earth now, quiet and final, and the west fence lay in the dirt where it had been and would not be standing again. It was done. Not cleanly. Her hand was burned and Maddox's arm was wrong, and somewhere out there in the night the guards who'd scattered through the broken west fence were running through scrub and rock in the dark. But Crane was in his chair with his ledgers, and the deputies had him, and the people who'd been locked inside that compound were walking through the east gate and not looking back. It wasn't clean. It was done. She put her hands in her pockets and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 5 days. The federal deputies stayed 3 days. They came with paperwork and a wagon for transporting prisoners, and a methodical efficiency that Elena found both reassuring and at moments quietly maddening. The way they moved through the compound, cataloging everything, asking the same questions of different people, writing things down in their careful official hand, while the women who'd been living inside that fence for weeks or months waited on the other side of the gate in the cold, and nobody seemed to be in a particular hurry to tell them what happened next. The marshal in charge was a man named Aldred, compact and gray-templed, with the permanently tired expression of someone who'd spent 20 years cleaning up messes that other people had made and had arrived at a professional relationship with the futility of it. He spoke to Elena on the first morning at a folding table he'd set up just inside the main gate, with a deputy beside him writing everything down. He asked her how she'd come to be at the camp. She told him, without embellishment, starting with Garrett coming through the door behind Darius and ending with the east gate opening. He wrote nothing while she spoke, and then wrote a great deal afterward, which told her he'd been doing this long enough to know that taking notes while people talked made them edit themselves. "The brother," he said when she finished. "Darius Cross. He's in Harlan County, as far as I know. The contract he signed, Ozzy, you said Crane's lawyer drafted it." "That's what Garrett told me." Aldred tapped his pen against the table once, twice. "The contracts are in the ledgers. We'll find it." He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down. "You understand I'll need to speak with you again once we've reviewed the documents." "I understand." "You'll be available." It wasn't a question. She looked at him steadily. "I'll be at whatever settlement these people end up in, yes." He held her gaze for a moment, assessing in the way of someone who'd learned to gauge people quickly and knew his own accuracy rate. Then he nodded and moved on to the next name on his list, and Elena got up from the chair and went back to the people she'd been helping organize since the night before. The logistics of 40 people with nowhere to go were not simple, and nobody else seemed to be thinking about them systematically, so Elena started thinking about them herself. Some of the women had homes to go back to, places they'd been taken from, families who didn't know what had happened. Those were the ones the deputies were most interested in, getting names and locations and descriptions for the reports that would go to county seats across the territory. Elena helped where she could, sitting beside women who were too shaken to answer questions clearly, speaking for them when they asked her to, keeping track of who needed to send word where, and making sure Aldred's deputies actually wrote it down rather than moving on. But some of them had nowhere. That was the harder truth that nobody official was addressing. Women who'd been taken from situations that weren't safe to return to, or who'd come west alone and had nothing behind them to go back to, or who'd simply been in the wrong place when Crane's men were looking for labor and had no people who would notice they were gone. Doris was one of these. 3 others she'd worked alongside in the kitchen were others. On the second afternoon, Elena counted heads. 12 women with nowhere clear to go. 4 men, laborers from the north side of the camp, in the same position. 16 people standing in the remains of Crane's compound with a collapsed mine and a broken fence and an adobe main building that still had its roof and its fireplace and, as it turned out, a functional kitchen. She found Maddox at the edge of the compound where the west fence had been, looking out at the raw scar of the mine collapse. His left arm was in a sling that Ruth had fashioned from a flour sack, tied with the confident competence of a woman who'd dealt with injuries before and didn't need to make a production of it. He'd been quieter since the night of the explosion, not withdrawn exactly, but moving through the aftermath with a deliberateness that felt like someone who'd done a hard thing and was now in the process of deciding what it meant. She stood beside him. The collapsed shaft had left a depression in the earth maybe 40 feet across, the edges crumbling, the timber that had shored the entrance now kindling under a ton of rock. The northwest corner of the fence was gone, just 2 standing posts leaning at wrong angles with wire trailing from them into the dirt. 12 women, she said. 4 men. No place to go. He looked at the depression. I know. The main building's sound. The kitchen works. There's a well inside the compound that's separate from the mine water. She paused. The land the camp sits on. Who does it belong to? Crane bought it off a homestead claim 4 years ago, he said. The original claimant is dead. With Crane in federal custody and his assets under review, the title's going to be in dispute. He glanced at her. Why? Because disputed title means nobody can move anyone off it while the legal question is open. And a legal question like this with federal involvement, she did the math the way she'd learned to do it from listening to county seat arguments at the store in Harlan County, the way information filtered down to people who paid attention. That takes months, maybe longer. You're thinking about staying. It wasn't quite a question. She considered the word staying and what it meant applied to a place she'd been brought to in chains, and decided that the word needed redefining more than the place did. I'm thinking about the 16 people with nowhere to go, she said, and a building with a roof and a kitchen and a well, and the fact that the freight road runs 2 miles south of here, and freight roads need places along them where people can get a meal and water their horses and sleep somewhere that isn't the open ground. He was quiet for a moment. A trading post. Or something like one. He looked at the collapsed mine, the broken fence, the adobe building with its good roof and bad associations. Then he looked at her. That's not a small thing, he said. No, she said. It's not. Aldred and his deputies left on the 3rd morning with Crane in the back of their wagon and Briggs beside him and 2 other men who'd held positions of authority in the camp. The rest of the guards had either scattered through the broken fence or been released with warnings that their names were now in federal documents and further involvement with Hollis Crane's operations would be treated accordingly. The ones who'd run through the fence were somebody else's problem and probably the territories, eventually. Elena stood at the east gate and watched the wagon go. Aldred had given her a card with an address in Santa Fe where correspondence regarding the case should be sent, and she'd put it in her coat pocket, and she'd remember to write when there was something to write about. Ruth came to stand beside her. Her knee was still bothering her. It had been bothering her since the river crossing on the wagon, 5 days and a lifetime ago. But she was moving on it without complaint, which was Ruth's general approach to most things. He's gone then, Ruth said. He's gone. Ruth looked at the road south, at the dust the wagon had raised still hanging in the cold air. What about the brother? Elena had been thinking about that. She'd been thinking about it in the specific way you thought about something you needed to decide and kept putting off deciding, circling it, picking it up and setting it down, getting closer each time without quite landing. Aldred will find the contract in the ledgers, she said. Whatever happens to Darius because of that is Aldred's jurisdiction. That's not what I asked. Elena looked at the road. I know. She hadn't seen Darius since she'd walked down those porch steps. She'd thought about him in the intervening days more than she'd wanted to. Not with the white-hot feeling she'd expected, but with something more complicated and more exhausting. The way you thought about a wound that had been part of you so long you weren't sure who you'd be without it. She'd thought about the biscuits she'd left on the table. She'd thought about how he'd said, "I'll come visit once you're settled," like she was moving into a boarding house by choice. And she'd thought about how she'd not been able to look at him, because looking at him would have made her unable to move, and she'd needed to move. She didn't know what she wanted to happen to Darius. That was the honest answer. She'd expected to want something clear and specific. Punishment, confrontation, the satisfaction of him understanding what he'd done. But the thing that had replaced the anger wasn't clear or specific. It was just absence. A kind of distance that felt less like resolution than like a door she'd shut without deciding to and now couldn't find the handle of. "I'll deal with that when the time comes," she said. Ruth made the sound she made when she considered something half an answer and was letting it be half an answer for now. "Fair enough," she said. Bam. They stayed. Not all 16. 3 of the women found rides east with a freight wagon that came through 2 days after the deputies left, heading towards settlements with family waiting. And one of the men decided he'd rather take his chances moving north on his own. But 12 people stayed, and 12 people turned out to be enough to do quite a lot with an adobe building and a working kitchen, and the combined knowledge of women who'd been doing hard practical work their entire lives. Doris turned out to be the best cook Elena had ever encountered in practical terms. Not fancy cooking, nothing with cream sauces or architectural presentation, but the kind of cooking that turned whatever you had into something that kept people warm and functioning, which was the only kind of cooking that mattered out here. She took charge of the kitchen with the authority of someone who'd found their correct domain and intended to remain in it, and Elena let her, because there was plenty else to be done. The main building's north room had been Crane's office, and before that could be anything else, it needed to be emptied, which meant going through the remaining paperwork the deputies hadn't taken and deciding what to keep and what to burn. Elena did this herself, mostly, in the afternoons of the first week. She read carefully, even the things that were legal documents she didn't fully understand, because she'd learned that not understanding something was different from the thing not mattering, and she made a pile of what she thought might be useful: land records, supply contracts, a correspondence with a freight company out of Tucson that included rates and schedules, and burned the rest in the fireplace. The north room became a different room. It took work and time and the specific effort of choosing to make it different, not just cleaning, but thinking about arrangement, about what a room was for and who would use it and how. Doris put a curtain over Crane's window that she'd made from a flour sack dyed with ground juniper berries, rust red and imperfect. And the imperfection of it somehow made the room look more like a place people lived in than any amount of careful furnishing would have. Ruth found the curtain deeply satisfying in a way she couldn't explain and didn't try to. Maddox stayed too, which surprised Elena slightly, or maybe it surprised her that she hadn't expected it. He was not a man who seemed to attach to places. Everything about how he moved and spoke said transient, said I'll be gone when the work is done. But he was still there a week after the deputies left, and then 2 weeks, working the fence line with the 4 men who'd decided to stay, replacing the broken posts and restringing the wire and cutting a proper gate in the west side where before there had been nothing. He didn't explain himself, and she didn't ask him to. What she noticed instead was smaller and more specific, the way he redistributed the work without being asked when someone was overtaxed, the way he'd learned everyone's names by the second day and used them correctly without making a thing of it, the way he listened when people talked to him, not with the polite vacancy of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with actual attention, the kind that cost something. She noticed that he checked on the horses every morning himself, regardless of who was supposed to do it, which told her something about what he valued. She noticed that he ate whatever was put in front of him without comment, even when what was put in front of him was the kind of desperate end-of-supplies creativity that would have made some men complain. She noticed that he didn't drink, which she hadn't expected, and that when one of the men produced a bottle of something brown and passed it around the fire one evening, Maddox declined it with a short no that had no apology in it and no explanation, and nobody pushed. One evening she found him sitting outside the west gate on an upturned crate, looking at the collapsed mine with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the assessing look, not the flat professional distance. Something quieter and less organized. She sat down on a rock a few feet away, not close enough to be intrusive, but close enough to be present. "Were you always doing this kind of thing?" she asked. "Before Crane? Before here." He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for an easy answer. "Different versions of it," he said. "Not always on the right side." She looked at the mind depression. What changed? A long silence. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just occupied by something he was actually thinking about. "Man I knew," he said finally. "Good man. Better than me, probably. Got caught up in something he shouldn't have because he didn't have anyone to help him get uncaught." He paused. Didn't end well. She didn't ask for more. He hadn't offered it as an invitation for more, just as information, the way he offered most things. "I'm sorry," she said. "Yeah." He looked at the collapsed entrance. "Me too." They sat in the cooling evening for a while without talking, and it wasn't strange, and it wasn't loaded with anything it didn't need to be loaded with, and that in itself was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't fill silence with himself the way a lot of men did. He let it be what it was. 3 weeks in, a freight wagon stopped. It came from the south. 2 men on the bench and a load covered with canvas, and they pulled up at the east gate because they'd seen smoke from the chimney and they needed water and somewhere to eat a meal that wasn't cold jerky. Elena fed them from what Doris had going, a bean pot and cornbread, plain and hot, and charged them what seemed fair for the water and the meal, and they paid without arguing and sat at the table in the main room for an hour before moving on. She stood at the gate and watched them go, and thought about the freight road 2 miles south, and about how many wagons a week used that road, and about what a reliable stopping point with a meal and water would be worth to people who spent weeks moving between settlements. Doris appeared at her elbow. "They left without complaining. That's the measure." "It is," Elena said. "You're going to turn this into something, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. Elena watched the freight wagon until it was dust on the road. "I'm going to try," she said. The trying was not elegant. It involved a great many things she didn't know and had to figure out in the doing of them. How to establish a supply arrangement with the general store in the nearest town, a 2-day ride east called Birch Crossing, when she had no credit and no established relationship and had to show up and make her case on the strength of what she could offer in return. How to put a rate on things without undervaluing them so much that the place couldn't sustain itself. How to settle arguments between people living in close quarters under stress, because those arguments happened and they got ugly sometimes, and someone had to be the person who walked into them and didn't make them worse. She was not always good at that last one. She had a temper she'd been managing her whole life, and there were moments when her patience wore through and she said something sharp that she'd then have to go back and address, which she did, because leaving things unaddressed made them worse. She was honest with herself about this the way she was honest with herself about most things. Not harshly, but clearly, without the luxury of pretending she was something she wasn't. Ruth watched all of this with the quiet attention of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize when something was worth paying attention to. She said, one evening when they were the last 2 awake and the fire was low, "You know what you're doing." Elena looked up from the supply list she'd been adding to. "Half the time." "That's more than most," Ruth said. "The other half, you figure it out." Elena looked at the list. The numbers were starting to work, barely, but actually. It felt like the most improbable thing she'd ever been part of, and she'd recently blown up a mine. "Ruth," she said. I'm glad you stayed." Ruth was quiet for a moment, then, "Where else would I go?" She said it lightly, but underneath the lightness was something that wasn't light at all. The whole weight of a woman who'd had that question come true and had found an answer she hadn't expected. Darius came in the 6th week. She saw him from across the compound, coming through the east gate on a horse she didn't recognize, wearing his good coat that she'd last seen hanging in the room in Harlan County. He looked worse than she'd ever seen him, hollowed out, dark under the eyes, the particular deterioration of a man who'd spent a month and a half with no one to make excuses to but himself. She didn't go to him. She stood where she was, near the well, and she waited, and he came to her because there was nothing else to do. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at the compound, the repaired fence, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, Doris's juniper-dyed curtain visible through the north window, two of the men working on a lean-to addition off the east wall. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. She looked at his face, which she knew as well as she knew anything, and she let herself feel the full complexity of that knowing, the years of it, the weight of it, the specific grief of loving someone who'd done the worst thing a person could do to you. "I know why you came," she said, "and I know what you want me to say." He looked at his hands on the reins. "I'm not going to make excuses." "Good. Don't." "I just—" His voice broke in the middle of the word, not dramatically, just the way voices broke when they got to the edge of something too big for speaking. "I need you to know that I know what I did." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the compound, and somewhere behind her, Ruth was calling something to one of the men about the lumber delivery. "Knowing it doesn't fix it, Darius," she said. "You understand that." "Yes." "And I'm not going to tell you it's all right, because it's not." He nodded, not looking at her. His jaw was tight. "But you can get down off that horse," she said, "and you can eat something. And after that—" She paused, finding the edge of what she meant. "We'll see." It was not forgiveness. She was clear-eyed enough about herself to know she wasn't there yet, and might not be for a long time, and she wasn't going to perform it for his comfort. But it was something. A door left slightly open, not because he deserved it, but because she'd decided that carrying the full weight of what he'd done was a burden she was choosing to set down, not for his sake, but for her own. He got down off the horse. He didn't say anything more, which was the right choice, and she turned and walked toward the kitchen to tell Doris there would be one more at the table. She did not look back at him. That too was a choice, the first of what would be many, in a life she was now building with her own hands, on ground she had no business being on and every right to claim. Darius stayed 2 weeks. He didn't ask permission, and Elena didn't offer it formally. He simply stayed, sleeping in the lean-to addition off the east wall with the other men, working whatever needed working without being told twice. He was quiet in the way of someone who understood that words were currently a liability, and labor was the only currency he had left that anyone here might accept. He split wood in the mornings. He helped string the new fence line on the south side. He carried water without complaining and fixed a wheel on the supply cart that had been listing for days and which everyone had been working around rather than addressing. Elena watched him without making it obvious that she was watching him. She was trying to locate, somewhere underneath the wreckage of what he'd done, the person she'd grown up alongside, the older brother who'd taught her to ride, who'd sat up with her through the nights after their mother died because neither of them could sleep, who'd been capable once, before the drinking and the debt and the particular corrosion that came from too many bad choices stacking up until a man couldn't see over them anymore. She found traces. They weren't enough to rebuild anything substantial, but they were there, which was something she hadn't been sure of. She did not tell him she forgave him, because she hadn't. She told him instead, one evening when they were both near the well and neither of them could reasonably walk away from the proximity, that Aldred's office had sent a letter. He went very still. "The contract," she said. "They found it in the ledgers. Crane's lawyer drafted it. They want testimony. From me and from you." She looked at him directly. "You're going to give it?" It wasn't a question. He knew it wasn't a question. "Yes," he said, without argument, without negotiation. Just the single word carrying the full weight of a man who understood this was the only direction left that wasn't completely wrong. She nodded. "Aldred's deputy will come through in the spring. I told them we'd both be here." She picked up the water bucket she'd set down. "Don't make me regret that." She walked away. Behind her, she heard him let out a breath, slow and uneven, the sound of someone who'd been bracing for something worse and had gotten something they could live with instead. She didn't turn around. The letter from Santa Fe came in the same week, and it changed things in ways Elena had expected and some she hadn't. Crane had entered a plea, not out of remorse, the letter made clear, but out of the particular calculation of a man who'd looked at the evidence against him and decided that cooperation might buy him something a trial wouldn't. The plea covered the labor trafficking charges and the fraudulent contracting and the bribery of county officials that Aldred's team had uncovered in the ledgers alongside everything else. The sentence was 20 years in the federal penitentiary, with asset forfeiture covering the gambling halls and the freight company and the land at Coldwater Flat. The land at Coldwater Flat. Elena read that section 3 times. Then she went and found Maddox, who was repairing a saddle outside the east gate, and she handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He read it again, slower. Then he looked up at her. Asset forfeiture, he said, meaning the federal government owns it now, until they decide what to do with it. She sat down on the crate he'd been using as a workbench. Aldred's letter says there's a provision. Lands that have been actively settled and improved by displaced persons may be subject to homestead claim under certain conditions. She paused. He included the form. Maddox set the letter down on his knee. He looked at the compound, the repaired fence, the lean-to, Doris's kitchen smoke threading out of the chimney in the cold morning air, 2 of the women hanging washing on a line they'd strung between the east wall and a post Maddox himself had set 3 weeks ago. That's a long process, he said. 8 months to a year, Aldred says, if the claim is filed correctly. She looked at him. I've already started filling out the form. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of something that other men would have made more visible, a quiet, private thing that lived mostly in the steadiness of his eyes and the slight change in the set of his jaw. Elena, he said. I know it's not guaranteed, she said. I know there'll be legal arguments and it might take longer than a year, and someone from the government might show up and decide to sell it to a railroad instead. She kept her voice even. But it's the best option we have, and it's an option, and 2 months ago I didn't think we'd have any options at all. He was quiet for a moment. You need a witness on the form, someone who can attest to continuous occupation and improvement. Yes. And you need people willing to put their names on a legal document that says they intend to stay. I've already asked Doris and Ruth and the 4 men, she said. They said yes. He picked up the letter and folded it carefully along its original creases. Then you should ask me too, he said. She looked at him. Are you staying? It was the most direct she'd been about it. She'd been working around the edges of the question for weeks, watching him and interpreting and not asking, because she'd learned a long time ago not to ask questions she wasn't ready to hear the answer to. But the form needed names, and the form had a deadline, and she was ready now. He held her gaze. I'm staying, he said. Not because of the form. She understood that. He said it in the way he said most things, without decoration, without managing her reaction, just the fact of it delivered plainly and left there to be what it was. All right, she said. She took the letter back and went inside and finished filling out the form with the particular careful handwriting she'd been practicing since she was a girl, back when their mother had insisted on it, saying, you write like someone who means what they're putting down. And the words had settled into her and stayed. Spring came slowly to that part of the territory, the cold holding on through March and into April, releasing its grip grudgingly in the way of climates that didn't owe anyone anything. But it came. The scrub oak leafed out, and the dry water course south of the compound ran with actual water for 3 weeks from snowmelt, and the days got long enough that work could be done in the evening light, which meant more got done. The freight traffic on the South Road picked up with the weather, the way it always did when the passes cleared. By April, they were seeing 3 or 4 wagons a week stopping at the East Gate, and by May, it was closer to 10, and Doris had expanded the kitchen operation to handle it, and had recruited 2 of the women who'd decided to stay permanently into a rotation that she managed with the focused authority of a general who'd found her correct campaign. They called the place Crossroads, which was Elena's suggestion, and which nobody argued with because it was accurate, and because they were all tired enough of the old name that anything else was welcome. The sign went up on the gatepost in May, carved by one of the men named Holt, who turned out to have a craftsman's hand with wood that nobody had known about until he'd put it to use on the lean-to expansion. Crossroads. Water, meals, rest. Practical. Nothing more than what it promised. The first time a family came through, a husband and wife and 3 children heading west in a wagon packed with everything they owned, and stopped for a meal and a night's rest in the lean-to that had been expanded twice and now held 4 proper bunks. Elena sat at the table with them while they ate and answered their questions about the territory ahead and felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not pride exactly, or not only pride. Something closer to the feeling of a thing being where it was supposed to be, which was different from happiness and more durable. The children ate 3 helpings each. Doris watched them with the expression of someone who considered clean plates a personal vindication. Ruth poured coffee for the husband and said completely unprompted, "This place was a labor camp 6 months ago. Woman sitting across from you blew up the mine and got everyone out." She said it conversationally, the way you mentioned weather. The husband looked at Elena with an expression of open recalibration. "Ruth," Elena said. "It's true," Ruth said pleasantly, and took her coffee back to the kitchen. The federal deputy came in late May for the testimony, a young man named Corrales, who was thorough and polite and spent 2 days taking statements from Elena and Darius, and 3 of the women who'd been in the camp and were willing to speak on record. He did his work carefully and without the slightly dismissive efficiency that Aldred had carried, and when he was done, he sat down with Elena at the table in the north room. Crane's old office, unrecognizable now, with its curtain and its mismatched chairs, and the supply ledger that had replaced the trafficking ledger on the desk, and told her that Crane's plea was holding and that the sentencing was scheduled for June in Santa Fe. "Will you come?" he asked. She thought about it. "No," she said. He seemed surprised. "You don't want to be there?" She looked at the surface of the desk, the supply ledger, the correspondence with the store in Birch Crossing, the homestead claim form with its 8 names, including her own at the top. "I know what happened," she said. "I don't need a courtroom to confirm it for me." He nodded slowly, and she could see him trying to place her in some category he understood, some story about victims who sought closure in proceedings, and finding that she didn't fit cleanly. She wasn't angry about not fitting. She'd stopped being angry about not fitting a long time ago. "The homestead claim," he said, looking at the copy she'd given him to forward to the federal land office. "You know these take a long time," she said. "Yes. And the outcome isn't certain," she said. "Yes, I know that too." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not worried?" She considered the question with more honesty than the usual social exchange required. "I'm worried about 100 things," she said. "Whether the supply arrangement with Birch Crossing holds when winter comes and the road's bad. Whether the lean-to roof is solid enough for heavy snow. Whether the women who left will find their way to something decent." She paused. "The land claim is on the list. It's not at the top." He left the next morning with his statements and his copies, and Darius rode out with him, which Elena had not known was coming. He appeared at the east gate on his borrowed horse while Corrales was loading his saddlebags, and he looked at Elena standing in the gate with an expression that had more in it than she knew how to read all at once. "I need to go back to Harlan County," he said. "There are things I owe people there." A pause. "Not just money." She looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say and selected the one that was true, without being either comfort or punishment. "Then go take care of them," she said. He nodded. He looked at the sign on the gate post. Crossroads. He looked at her one more time with the particular helplessness of someone who understood that words were not going to do the work they needed to do here, that only time and action had any chance of doing it, and that he'd burned enough of both that there was no knowing yet whether it was possible. "Elena," he said. "Darius," she said. He turned his horse and rode out behind Corrales, and she watched until the road bent south and took him out of sight, and she stood in the gate for a while longer by herself, feeling the full weight of everything that had passed between them and everything that hadn't and everything that might still, over years and circumstances she couldn't predict. She didn't know what Darius would do. She'd spent a long time thinking she knew what he'd do and being wrong about it, and she'd decided that knowing wasn't her job anymore. What he did with the rest of his life was his work. What she did with hers was hers. She went back inside. Ig. The summer settled into itself the way summers did, with work and difficulty and moments that were unexpectedly good mixed in with the ones that weren't. The roof of the lean-to did need reinforcing. Maddox and Holt spent 3 days on it in July, and the result was sound but not pretty, which seemed appropriate. The supply arrangement with Birch Crossing held and then improved when the store owner came through in August with his wife and saw the operation and offered better terms in exchange for first-stop rights with his recommended travelers. Elena negotiated that conversation herself at the table in the north room, and she got terms that were better than what he'd opened with, which she was honest enough to be quietly pleased about. Maddox watched that conversation from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. Afterward, when the store owner and his wife were eating in the main room, he came and sat across from her and looked at her with that expression she'd been cataloging for months. "You didn't need me in there," he said. "No," she said, "but it's useful to have someone standing in the doorway who looks like you." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "Is that the only thing I'm useful for?" She looked at him across the table, this man who'd ridden down a dark road after a trafficking wagon, for reasons that had started as something professional and had clearly become something else over months she hadn't been keeping track of carefully enough. This man who'd planned a federal operation across 8 months and still found time to reset a loose post in the south fence because he'd noticed it listing and hadn't mentioned it to anyone, just fixed it. This man who slept lightly and woke quickly and never explained why, and who she'd stopped asking because some things didn't need to be excavated to be understood. "No," she said, "it's not the only thing." He nodded, picked up his coffee, drank it. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough, and neither of them felt the need to make it larger than what it was. That was something she'd learned about the two of them over these months. They both had a tolerance for the unspoken that was high enough to be comfortable and honest enough not to be avoidance. They understood each other across the quiet in a way that felt more reliable than most declarations. She wasn't sure what to call it. She wasn't sure she needed to. The land claim came through in November. Not the final decision, that was still months away, the letter said, pending review by the Federal Land Office. But the preliminary confirmation that the claim was valid, the settlement was recognized as occupied, and the review would proceed without contest from any prior claim holder. Aldred had apparently put in a word, which she hadn't asked him to do and chose to feel simply grateful for rather than complicated about. She read the letter twice at the table in the north room with the morning light coming through Doris's juniper curtain in its particular rust-red way, and then she put it down and sat with it for a while before telling anyone. She thought about the room she'd grown up in, the hill country in Missouri, her mother's hands working bread dough at a table that was too small for the amount of work it got asked to do. She thought about Darius saying, "I didn't have a choice," which was the sentence she'd carried the longest and would probably carry the longest still. She thought about a wagon in the dark and a burn mark on 2 knuckles that had healed into a thin white line she could still trace with a finger. She thought about the fact that she was 23 years old and sitting in a room that she had made hers out of the wreckage of someone else's worst impulses, and that outside this door were people who'd gotten here the same way she had, not by plan, not by luck exactly, but by refusing to accept what someone else had decided their life was worth. That refusal was the thing, she thought. Not the explosion, not the federal case, not the legal claim or the supply arrangement or the sign on the gatepost. Those were all results. The refusal was the source. The moment on the wagon when she'd looked at Garrett and said no, but I'll come anyway. Not because she'd had a plan, but because something in her had simply declined to be what they were trying to make her. She'd met other women in those 2 months since the camp came down, who'd been through similar things and had responded differently. Not worse, not weaker, just differently, with grief or paralysis or anger that turned inward. And she understood that response. She could feel the shape of it from the inside, the way you understood a road you'd been on enough to know the grade of it. What she'd done instead wasn't virtue, it was just the particular way she was put together, the stubbornness that had irritated Darius her whole life and turned out to be the most useful thing about her. You couldn't take credit for the way you were put together, but you could choose what to do with it. She picked up the letter and went to find Ruth. Ruth was in the kitchen, which was where Ruth always was in the morning, sitting at the small table near the back window with her bad knee extended and her coffee in hand, doing the work of doing nothing for 20 minutes before the day started demanding things of her. She looked at Elena when she came in and looked at the letter in her hand. "Good news or complicated news?" Ruth asked. "Both," Elena said, "but more good." Ruth took the letter and read it. She read it through to the end and then set it on the table and picked up her coffee and looked out the back window at the compound where the morning light was doing what morning light did to high desert country, making it look briefly like it was made of something more valuable than rock and dust. "Well," Ruth said. "All right then." Elena sat down across from her. "All right," she agreed. They drank their coffee in the morning quiet, while outside the compound came a wake around them. The sound of the men starting on the day's work, Doris moving pots, the east gate opening for the first freight wagon of the day. The ordinary texture of a place that was alive and intended to stay that way. Maddox appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Elena and at the letter on the table. "Preliminary confirmation," she said. "Land claim proceeding." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the pot and poured himself coffee and leaned against the wall and said nothing, which was his way of saying something. She'd gotten fluent in it. "There's a family coming through today," she said, "heading west." They rode ahead. 4 adults, 2 children, 2 wagons. They'll need meals and a place to sleep and someone to tell them what the road looks like past the ridge. "Holt knows the ridge road," Maddox said. "I know. Ask him to be around this afternoon." He nodded. He drank his coffee. The morning came in through the kitchen window and the curtain moved in the draft from the open door, and Ruth's knee was bothering her and Elena's 2 knuckles had a white scar across them, and none of it was resolved the way stories were supposed to resolve, with everything tied and nothing left raw. But she was here. That was the thing that kept being true. She was here, and she had stayed and she had made something. Imperfect, uncertain, built out of materials that nobody else had wanted and work that didn't stop. And the people around her had stayed too, for their own reasons, and with their own damaged histories and their own particular stubbornness. And together, they'd made a thing that hadn't existed before. That was what Elena Cross would think about later when people passing through asked her how Crossroads got started and she tried to explain it. Not the federal case or the explosion or even Rhett Maddox riding down a dark road after a wagon, because he'd decided that some things couldn't be left alone. She'd think about the moment on the wagon when the choice had been to surrender or to start planning, and she'd chosen to plan even when she had nothing to plan with. People got taken from. That was a fact about the world she'd known since she was 9 years old watching fever take her mother. What you did after the taking was the only part you owned. She owned this, all of it. The imperfect fence and the rust-colored curtain and the listing lean-to roof and the homestead claim that was still months from certain. She owned the ongoing work of being in the same world as her brother without knowing yet what that would mean. She owned the quiet that lived between her and Maddox that was full of things still finding their shape. She owned the sign on the gatepost. Crossroads. Practical. Nothing more than what it promised. Outside, a freight wagon came through the gate, and Holt called a greeting, and Doris began moving with the particular efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and intended to keep doing it, and the day opened itself up the way days did, full of the ordinary weight of living, which was heavier than people said and more worth carrying. Elena Cross picked up her coffee and went to meet it.